September 1943. Beneath the burden of Nazi occupation, the cobblestone pathways of Assisi, Italy, fall eerily quiet. This timeless hilltop settlement, the very birthplace of Street Francis and a symbol of peace spanning 8 centuries, now conceals a secret so perilous that its exposure guarantees instant death. Within the Basilica of Street Francis, under frescoes painted by Giotto's own hand, a Franciscan priest by the name of Rufino Niccacci feeds documents into a modest stone hearth. These aren't routine church files or aging hymnals. They're Jewish identification records, certificates of birth, licenses of marriage, anything capable of exposing the actual identities of the 300 souls currently concealed throughout Assisi's religious houses, convents, and civilian residences. Should the Gestapo uncover even a single one of these papers, the entire operation crumbles. Every clergyman becomes marked for death. Every sister becomes labeled a conspirator. Every Jewish person in hiding becomes a casualty. This represents the narrative they neglected to share in your classroom. This tells the account of how a coordinated group of religious figures transformed a medieval Italian community into among the most daring underground escape routes of the Second World War. By this video's conclusion, you'll understand why this rescue mission stayed hidden in obscurity for almost 3 decades following the war's end. Assisi, during early 1943, existed as a community suspended between 2 realities. On one hand, Benito Mussolini's deteriorating Italian fascist regime was losing its grip on authority as Allied troops pushed northward from Sicily. On the opposite hand, Nazi Germany stood ready to seize every portion of Italy to stop its total breakdown. For Jewish populations distributed across central Italy, the warning signs were unmistakable. Hitler's final solution had moved beyond hushed rumors in darkness. It had become an industrialized killing apparatus advancing across Europe, with Italy positioned as its next target. Thousands of Jewish households, who had previously felt protected under Italian governance, now confronted a terrible decision. Move southward toward Allied territory through active combat areas, remain concealed and hope for survival, or face transport to camps whose designations would eventually become interchangeable with hell itself. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. Down in Rome, merely 100 miles southward, the Gestapo had already begun compiling lists. Throughout Florence, mass arrests were underway. And here in Assisi, a modest circle of clergy members stood poised to make a choice that would endanger their existence, their beliefs, and their complete community. The individual destined to architect this clandestine operation wasn't some experienced intelligence agent or combat-tested resistance warrior. Father Rufino Niccacci had reached 33 years of age, an unassuming Franciscan clergyman who taught mathematics at a neighborhood seminary. He'd never discharged a firearm. He'd never crafted a fraudulent document. He'd never deceived armed troops trained in spotting lies. Yet, in September of 1943, his superior, Bishop Giuseppe Nicolini, entered his quarters and posed a question that would transform everything. The bishop didn't inquire whether Niccacci wished to assist. He didn't question if Niccacci possessed sufficient bravery. He merely asked whether Niccacci recalled his sacred promises to serve those suffering, to shield the innocent, to follow the path of Street. Francis, who ages earlier, had marched unarmed into a sultan's military encampment to negotiate peace. Niccacci answered affirmatively. He possessed no understanding of what he was committing to. Within 3 days' time, the initial Jewish escapees reached Assisi. They arrived in limited numbers, moving under cover of darkness, led by agricultural workers and compassionate locals familiar with the remote passages and mountain routes. They appeared exhausted, terrified, carrying only what could fit within a single piece of luggage. Mothers, gripping babies, aged couples who had traveled by foot for multiple days, young people who had witnessed their parents taken during midnight operations. They carried no documentation, no currency, and no strategy beyond staying alive. Waiting for them in Assisi stood Father Niccacci, a mathematics instructor turned underground organizer, who now needed to determine how to conceal 300 individuals in a community swarming with German patrols. The monasteries offered space, yet lacked food allocations for additional people. The convents could provide shelter for women and youngsters, but risked drawing suspicion if nuns were observed purchasing abnormal quantities of provisions. Private dwellings remained susceptible to unannounced searches. Every concealment location represented a measured gamble. Every day tested faith, creativity, and pure determination. The approach Niccacci designed proved as ingenious as it was sacrilegious by Nazi measures. He would conceal Jews in obvious view by converting them into Catholic religious figures. Men transformed into monks, clothed in brown Franciscan garments, heads shaved into tonsures, mastering how to lower their heads and whisper Latin supplications. Women became nuns, donning black habits, covering their hair, adopting fresh identities from the catalogue of saints. Young ones were positioned in convent educational facilities, instructed to recite the Hail Mary and participate in Mass as though they'd done so throughout their entire existence. The document forgers labored continuously, producing false baptismal certificates predated years into history, complete with fabricated godparents and parish stamps. The printers obtained blank identification cards bearing official governmental insignias. And Father Niccacci, the gentle-natured mathematics instructor, became the director of an ensemble performing a lethal symphony of falsehood. One incorrect note, one verbal mistake, one Hebrew prayer mumbled during sleep, and the complete town would be consumed by flames. Yet here's what renders this account remarkable. What distinguishes it from other wartime rescue missions you might have encountered? The clergy of Assisi didn't merely conceal Jews for several days or weeks until they could be transported elsewhere. They maintained them hidden for 18 months, enduring harsh German interrogations, weathering random household inspections, surviving betrayals and narrow escapes that should have concluded in slaughter. When the war ultimately ended in 1945 and the refugees stepped out from their concealment locations, not a solitary one of the 300 had been seized, not one had been deported, not one had perished at Nazi hands. It represented a miracle of organization, bravery, and unified silence. Yet for decades, virtually nobody knew it had occurred. To comprehend why Assisi became the improbable stage for this mission, you must grasp what made this community distinct from every other Italian municipality under Nazi control. Assisi wasn't simply another medieval hillside community with ancient fortifications and confined passages. It was, and continues to be, among the most sacred pilgrimage destinations in the Catholic universe. The Basilica of St. Francis, with its invaluable frescoes and the burial site of Christianity's most cherished saint, attracted thousands of pilgrims annually, even throughout wartime. German officers, many being Catholic themselves, received orders to regard Assisi as a protected cultural territory. No aerial bombardment, no artillery fire, minimal military occupation to prevent damaging the artwork. This provided the town a delicate layer of safety that other Italian municipalities didn't possess. Yet it also signified something far more precious to Father Niccacci and his operation: continual movement. Pilgrims, clergy from different territories, church administrators traveling between Rome and northern dioceses. Within this endless stream of religious traffic, several additional monks or nuns wouldn't attract attention. Anonymity achieved through visibility, protection found on sacred earth. However, that safeguard proved delicate, and everyone in Assisi understood this. During October of 1943, merely weeks following the rescue operation's launch, Nazi Germany finalized its occupation of central Italy. The disintegrating Italian government capitulated, and abruptly, German troops weren't simply passing through anymore. They were establishing permanent positions. Gestapo operatives set up offices in commandeered structures. SS divisions established roadblocks on routes entering and exiting the community. Most hazardous of all, Nazi administrators began implementing census audits, cross-examining current inhabitant rosters against pre-war documentation. Anyone appearing on the fresh lists but absent from the historical ones would be identified for questioning. For the 300 Jewish refugees currently existing as Catholic clergy, this posed a potential execution sentence. Their counterfeit papers might survive a rapid examination by a soldier at a checkpoint, but a comprehensive bureaucratic analysis by German intelligence personnel trained in identifying discrepancies, that presented an entirely different challenge. Father Niccacci understood he required assistance beyond what the Franciscan Brotherhood could supply independently. He contacted Luigi and Trento Brizzi, a local printer, and his son, operating a modest establishment in Assisi's central plaza. The Brizzis weren't clergy members. They were regular citizens, a father and son, attempting to endure the occupation like everybody else. Yet they possessed something Niccacci desperately required: access to official government paper inventory, genuine stamps, and most critically, the technical expertise to manufacture documents capable of deceiving trained Nazi examiners. The Brizzis consented to participate in the operation, fully conscious of the ramifications. In Nazi-occupied Italy, creating false identification papers for Jews carried an automatic capital punishment, not imprisonment, not a work camp, execution by firing squad, frequently within 1 day of capture. Nevertheless, the Brizzis converted their printing establishment into a forgery workshop, laboring through the nighttime hours to generate baptismal certificates, ration documents, and identity papers for people whose actual names they never inquired about and whose appearances they attempted to not retain in memory. The operation broadened quietly, cautiously, through hushed exchanges and unspoken agreements. The Bishop of Assisi, Giuseppe Nicolini, employed his position to supply ecclesiastical protection, signing fraudulent documents and guaranteeing the legitimacy of newly created clergy members. When German officers arrived asking inquiries, the Mother Superior of the Convent of St. Colette, Sister Ermela Brandi, transformed her complete establishment into a sanctuary for Jewish women and youngsters, instructing them in Catholic ceremonies during daylight and consoling them through terrors during nighttime hours. Even the municipal police commander, an individual named Arnaldo Fortini, discreetly joined the conspiracy, alerting Niccacci whenever the Gestapo scheduled surprise examinations and conveniently misplacing documentation that might have revealed inconsistencies in the refugee community. This wasn't a structured resistance unit with aliases and secret gatherings. It was an interconnected web of mutual danger, where each individual grasped that their survival hinged on everyone else's silence. By November of 1943, Assisi had evolved into a living contradiction. On the exterior, it stayed a peaceful, sacred municipality, its churches resonating with the sounds of Gregorian hymns and the scent of frankincense. German officers participated in Mass at the Basilica, bowing their heads in worship beneath the identical roof that provided protection for Jewish families, concealed 3 levels overhead. Yet, underneath that appearance of normality, a complete shadow society existed. Jewish men committed Catholic prayers to memory phonetically, fumbling through Latin expressions they didn't comprehend. Jewish mothers observed their youngsters play in convent open spaces, frightened that an accidental slip in Yiddish might carry to the incorrect listeners. And Father Niccacci moved through everything like a phantom, managing food distributions, supervising the forgery mission, and lying with growing assurance each time a German officer posed him a direct inquiry. The apparatus of rescue was functioning. However, the trial had merely commenced. The initial genuine test arrived on a frigid morning during December of 1943. A Gestapo officer designated Colonel Valentin Müller reached Assisi with instructions to execute a thorough examination of the community's population. Müller wasn't a simpleton. He was a decorated intelligence administrator who had dismantled resistance operations in France and Belgium. An individual trained in detecting the microscopic fractures in a fabricated narrative. He arrived accompanied by a team of administrative workers carrying ledgers, typewriters, and stacks of pre-war census records. His assignment was straightforward. Account for every single individual residing in Assisi, confirm their identities against historical documentation, and pinpoint anyone who didn't belong. For Father Niccacci and the rescue operation, this represented the catastrophic scenario they had been fearing. Müller wasn't simply inspecting papers at a roadblock. He was constructing a database, and databases possess perfect recall. They don't experience fatigue. They don't avert their gaze. Niccacci convened an urgent gathering with Bishop Nicolini, the Brizzi household, and the leaders of each monastery and convent, providing refuge for escapees. They possessed perhaps 3 days before Müller's squad began, cross-examining identities and appearances. The bishop reached a determination that appeared irrational on its exterior, yet was potentially the sole option that could function. Rather than concealing the refugees more deeply, rather than attempting to transport them out of Assisi under German surveillance, they would execute the reverse. They would introduce them to Müller straightforwardly, but not as Jews. As clergy members who had recently transferred to Assisi from war-devastated territories of Italy, the narrative was uncomplicated. Allied bombing operations in the southern regions had obliterated monasteries and convents, compelling religious societies to move northward to more secure locations. Assisi, being a safeguarded holy destination, was the reasonable choice. The account was credible. The turmoil of warfare made flawless records unattainable, and most significantly, it provided the refugees a justification to exist in official registries without prompting immediate distrust. The Brizzis labored continuously to fabricate transfer records, correspondence from fictitious bishops in destroyed communities, and travel authorizations dated weeks previously. Every refugee received a comprehensive backstory. Their origin location, which monastery or convent they had belonged to, the duration of their membership in their religious order. These weren't merely false identities anymore. They were complete, manufactured existences, committed to memory, down to the tiniest particular. A Jewish adolescent from Poland became Sister Maria Benedetta, from a demolished convent in Salerno, whose mother superior had perished in an Allied air assault. A middle-aged bookkeeper from Florence became Brother Giovanni from a Franciscan monastery in Naples, relocated northward when German troops requisitioned the structure. The refugees practiced their narratives like performers readying for debut night, because that's precisely what this represented. A performance where the spectators wielded submachine guns and the critiques were inscribed in bloodshed. When Colonel Müller initiated his interviews, Father Niccacci personally guided him through each monastery and convent, preserving a composed demeanor that revealed none of the dread churning in his abdomen. Müller was methodical. He posed questions crafted to expose pretenders, particulars about specific Catholic ceremonies, the designations of saints honored on particular feast occasions, the arrangement of churches in communities the refugees claimed to originate from. Yet Niccacci had prepared them thoroughly. More significantly, Müller's own biases functioned against him. He anticipated Jews to be anxious, perspiring, incapable of sustaining eye contact. He anticipated them to fail at fundamental Catholic understanding. What he encountered instead were men and women who bowed their heads in supplication, who crossed themselves with rehearsed fluidity, who responded to his inquiries in gentle, modest voices suitable for monastic existence. His distrust persisted, but distrust without evidence was meaningless, and the documents the Brizzis had created were impeccable. The examination continued for 9 days. 9 days of inspections, interviews, and document assessments. 9 days where every knock on a monastery entrance could signify discovery. Every question could be the one that dismantled everything. Yet on the 10th day, Colonel Müller submitted his documentation and departed Assisi. His determination, the community's population was aligned with wartime displacement trends. No urgent concerns, no detentions recommended. Father Niccacci stood in the entrance of the basilica and observed Müller's vehicle vanish down the serpentine mountain passage. He didn't commemorate. He didn't offer prayers of thanksgiving. He simply rotated around, proceeded back inside, and readied himself for the subsequent crisis, because he understood this was solely the commencement. The operation had endured its initial trial, but in Nazi-occupied Italy there was perpetually another trial approaching, and the probability of succeeding through every single one was impossibly, frighteningly minimal. Enduring Colonel Muller's examination didn't deliver comfort, it delivered understanding. Father Niccacci and his operation now comprehended the authentic character of their circumstances. This wasn't a provisional arrangement that would persist for several weeks until the Allies freed Italy. This was a long-range mission that demanded sustainable mechanisms, not frantic improvisation. The 300 Jewish refugees concealed in Assisi required nourishment, medical supplies, garments, and most hazardously, they required currency. Monasteries and convents functioned on charitable contributions and agricultural revenue that scarcely sustained their own inhabitants. Adding 300 mouths to nourish generated a resource emergency that couldn't be resolved with supplication alone. Niccacci required funds, and he required them without leaving a documentation trail that German accountants could trace. He discovered his resolution in the most improbable location, the Vatican. Through Bishop Nicolini's associations, Niccacci established communication with a Vatican administrator named Monsignor Giovanni Montini, who would subsequently become Pope Paul VI. Montini was secretly managing Catholic rescue initiatives across occupied Europe, channeling currency from papal treasuries and affluent Catholic benefactors into clandestine operations. Yet the Vatican couldn't simply transfer currency to a modest town priest without provoking Gestapo distrust. Every banking transaction was scrutinized, every substantial cash extraction was documented. Therefore, Montini conceived a mechanism of messengers, trusted clergy members, who journeyed between Rome and Assisi, transporting donations camouflaged as routine church contributions. These messengers endangered their existences each time they traversed through German roadblocks, transporting thousands of lire concealed in false-bottomed luggage and hollowed prayer volumes. One messenger apprehended with that volume of cash would reveal the complete Vatican association. Yet the currency continued arriving, and with it, the operation continued breathing. Nourishment introduced an even more intricate challenge. Ration documents in Nazi-occupied Italy were connected to official identification papers. Every individual received a monthly distribution based on their registered position. Yet the 300 refugees, despite now possessing fraudulent papers, couldn't abruptly materialize on ration registries without provoking inquiries about why Assisi's food utilization had increased so dramatically. Niccacci approached the local agricultural workers, the contadini, who cultivated the farmland encircling Assisi. These weren't political organizers or resistance combatants. They were simple peasants whose families had resided in the shadow of the basilica for generations, people whose bloodlines had cultivated the identical plots of earth for ages. Niccacci appealed to their beliefs, their sense of Christian obligation, and their animosity toward the German occupiers who had commandeered their harvests and livestock. Gradually, quietly, the farmers commenced diverting segments of their yield. Several extra sacks of grain, wheels of cheese that never reached German storage facilities, chickens that were documented as deceased but ended up in monastery kitchens. It was limited-scale resistance, invisible to occupation authorities, yet cumulatively it maintained 300 people alive. The women and youngsters, concealed in the convent of Street Colette, confronted a distinctive hazard that male refugees in monasteries didn't encounter. Young ones, particularly small youngsters, couldn't be anticipated to preserve flawless discipline. They wept, they engaged in play, they disregarded their fabricated narratives. And in a convent where quietness and routine were sacred, the abrupt existence of energetic, youthful voices was challenging to justify. Mother Superior Ermela Brandi resolved this predicament by converting the convent into an unofficial orphanage. She circulated word through local parishes that the convent was accepting youngsters displaced by Allied bombing operations in southern Italy. German authorities, eager to present themselves as compassionate in their administration, sanctioned the initiative. It provided them favorable propaganda. Observe how the Reich safeguards Italian youngsters. What they didn't recognize was that numerous of those youngsters were Jewish, that their mothers existed camouflaged as nuns in the identical structure, and that the complete operation existed to maintain families united while preserving credible deniability. The youngsters participated in Catholic education during daylight hours, mastered prayers and hymns, and then returned to their mothers during nighttime hours in chambers the Germans never considered examining. Yet the most hazardous element of daily existence in concealment wasn't nourishment or currency or counterfeit documents. It was human character. 300 people existing under perpetual strain, unable to depart, unable to contact family members outside Assisi, unable to know whether their relatives were alive or deceased in the camps. Depression was widespread. Disputes erupted over insignificant matters. Some refugees, particularly the aged, commenced to lose hope, murmuring that perhaps it would be simpler to surrender themselves rather than exist in this perpetual state of dread. Father Niccacci discovered himself functioning not merely as an organizer, but as a counselor, moving between concealment locations to inspire, to comfort, to remind people that survival was itself an act of defiance. He possessed no training for this, no psychology credentials, merely a simple conviction that every existence preserved was a triumph against the apparatus of extermination. And therefore he continued advancing, day after impossible day, maintaining together an operation that should have disintegrated under its own burden a dozen times previously. By spring of 1944, the operation had cultivated rhythms and routines that provided the appearance of stability, yet appearances fragment rapidly in wartime. Allied troops were progressing northward through Italy, liberating communities and villages as they pushed toward Rome. This should have represented positive news, an indication that liberation was approaching. Instead, it rendered the circumstances in Assisi exponentially more hazardous. Retreating German troops became paranoid, savage, and erratic. Officers who had previously demonstrated restraint now executed random operations and arbitrary detentions. The Gestapo, sensing their authority diminishing, intensified their pursuit for partisans, resistance members, and anyone assisting enemies of the Reich. And in this climate of escalating violence, even the smallest error could provoke catastrophe. The operation had endured through caution and exactness. Now, they needed to endure through fortune. The initial fracture in their defense originated from an unexpected source, a refugee designated Julio Kropf. Kropf was a Jewish university professor from Trieste who had reached Assisi in the early phases of the operation. He had been provided the identity of Brother Paolo, a Franciscan monk from a demolished monastery in Calabria. For months, he had preserved his disguise flawlessly, participating in prayers, laboring in the monastery garden, maintaining his head lowered. Yet, isolation and dread had been consuming away at his sanity. During April of 1944, Kropf reached a determination that nearly destroyed everything. He departed the monastery without authorization, proceeded into Assisi's town plaza in broad daylight, and attempted to dispatch a letter to his spouse in Switzerland. A letter composed in German, employing his actual identity, explaining where he was concealing. The local postal administrator, an individual designated Bruno Fascia, who was secretly sympathetic to the operation, intercepted the letter before it could be processed. He immediately contacted Father Niccacci. Niccacci confronted an impossible decision. Kropf had violated every security protocol, endangered 300 existences, and demonstrated that he could no longer be trusted to preserve discipline. The rational determination, the determination that would safeguard the majority, was to expel Kropf from Assisi and allow him to manage for himself. Yet Niccacci couldn't execute it. His beliefs wouldn't permit it. Instead, he confronted Kropf in a modest chapel inside the monastery. And for the initial time since the operation commenced, Niccacci elevated his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't shame. He simply communicated to Kropf the truth. that his letter could have been intercepted by German censors, that postal laborers were obligated to report suspicious correspondence, that one moment of vulnerability could result in mass executions. Kropf disintegrated, weeping in the pew, apologizing repeatedly. Niccacci didn't pardon him. He didn't need to. He simply relocated Kropf to a different monastery, reinforced security protocols, and added another layer of supervision to prevent future incidents. Grace without naivety, compassion without foolishness. Yet the Kropf incident revealed a larger predicament that Niccacci had been attempting to disregard. The longer the refugees remained in concealment, the more the psychological pressure accumulated. People were reaching their breaking points. Some refugees commenced taking hazardous chances, sneaking out during nighttime to walk the streets and experience momentarily liberated. Others ceased eating, convinced that death was unavoidable and preferring starvation to capture. The Catholic clergy concealing them were themselves depleted, operating on fumes of faith and adrenaline. Nuns, who had once been patient and nurturing, now reacted sharply at youngsters over minor infractions. Monks who had preserved flawless composure during German examinations now trembled during evening prayers. Everyone was fraying. Everyone was one unfortunate day away from collapse. And Father Niccacci, the individual maintaining it all together, was beginning to fracture himself. He ceased sleeping more than 3 hours nightly. He lost weight, his Franciscan garments hanging loosely on a frame that had once been sturdy. His hands developed a tremor he couldn't regulate, yet he couldn't halt. Halting signified contemplating, and contemplating signified confronting the statistical reality that no clandestine operation this massive had ever endured this extensively, without betrayal, without discovery, without slaughter. History offered no successful template for what they were attempting. Every morning, Niccacci awakened, anticipating the day to be their final. Every evening, when the sun descended over Assisi's ancient fortifications and another day had passed without disaster, he permitted himself one moment of cautious relief before commencing to worry about tomorrow. This was the concealed expense of rescue. Not merely the danger of death, but the certainty of trauma. The knowledge that even if they succeeded, even if all 300 refugees survived, the people who preserved them would transport the burden of those 18 months for the remainder of their existences. June of 1944 delivered a moment that should have signified salvation. Allied troops liberated Rome on the 4th of June, transmitting shockwaves through German-occupied Italy. American armored vehicles rolled through streets where months previously Jews had been assembled and deported. The Pope materialized on his balcony to bless the liberators. For the initial time since the invasion, the momentum had definitively shifted. Yet Assisi was 100 miles northward of Rome, still securely behind German positions, and the Wehrmacht wasn't retreating peacefully. They were implementing a scorched earth tactic, demolishing infrastructure, mining passages, and eliminating anyone they suspected of collaboration. The German commandant in Assisi received fresh instructions directly from Berlin. Increase surveillance, eliminate partisan activity, and prepare defensive positions in case Allied troops advanced further northward. For Father Niccacci and his operation, Rome's liberation didn't deliver hope. It delivered a tightening snare. The fresh German commandant assigned to Assisi was a captain designated Werner Schmidt, and he was nothing like the officers who had preceded him. Schmidt was a genuine believer, a zealot who perceived betrayal in every Italian countenance and partisans concealing behind every entrance. He established a curfew, implemented mandatory identity verifications at random times throughout the day, and ordered his troops to execute surprise examinations of religious structures without alert. No longer could Niccacci depend on advanced notice from sympathetic police administrators. No longer could refugees be relocated between concealment locations before Germans arrived. Schmidt's troops burst through monastery entrances at dawn, demanded to observe everyone present, and questioned anyone whose countenance didn't match their internal expectations. The margin for error had contracted to nothing. During one examination in late June, Schmidt's troops entered the convent of St. Colette while Jewish youngsters were participating in their daily lessons. The Mother Superior possessed mere seconds to respond. She couldn't conceal the youngsters. They were already visible through the classroom windows. She couldn't justify why so many youngsters were present. The numbers exceeded what any legitimate orphanage would accommodate. Therefore, she executed the sole thing she could conceive of. She lied with such conviction that the truth became irrelevant. When Schmidt entered the classroom, she greeted him warmly, explained that these were students from households across the territory transmitted to Assisi for protection, and then invited him to observe their catechism lesson. She had one of the Jewish girls, a 9-year-old designated Graziella Verbi, who had committed Catholic prayers to memory phonetically without comprehending a word, stand and recite the Apostles' Creed. Graziella's voice trembled, yet she delivered every line perfectly. Schmidt observed, his expression unreadable, while Graziella spoke words that her own beliefs prohibited her from accepting. When she completed, Schmidt nodded, complimented the Mother Superior on her educational program, and departed. Graziella collapsed into her chair the moment the entrance closed, and later that night her mother embraced her while she wept, whispering apologies for compelling her daughter to deny their heritage to endure. Yet not every close call concluded so cleanly. In early July, a German patrol halted a man clothed as a Franciscan monk on a road outside Assisi. The man's designation was Saul Cantoni, a merchant from Milan, concealing under the identity of Brother Antonio. The troops requested his papers. Cantoni produced his counterfeit documents, perfectly crafted by the Brizzi household. The troops examined them, discovered nothing suspicious, and then requested Cantoni to recite the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, in Latin. Cantoni had committed it to memory weeks previously, practiced it dozens of times, yet standing on that road with rifles directed at his chest, his mind went blank. He stammered, he mixed up lines, he froze. The troops arrested him on the spot. Within 2 hours, he was in Gestapo custody, being interrogated about where he had obtained fraudulent documents and who else in Assisi was concealing under fake identities. Father Niccacci received word of the detention by evening and comprehended immediately. If Cantoni fractured under torture, if he revealed identities, locations, the complete forgery operation, the network was finished. That night, Niccacci didn't sleep at all. He sat in the basilica, staring at the fresco, depicting Street Francis, preaching to the birds, and wondered if he had guided 300 people into a trap. Cantoni knew almost everything. He knew which monasteries accommodated refugees. He knew the Brizzis were forgers. He knew Bishop Nicolini was involved. Under Gestapo interrogation, men revealed secrets they had vowed to transport to their graves. Bones fractured, minds shattered. And once the torture commenced, silence became impossible. Niccacci prayed that Cantoni would be strong. Yet prayer felt like a weak defense against pliers, electrodes, and systematic brutality. All he could execute was wait for the inevitable knock on the entrance, the German voices demanding entry, the moment when 18 months of miracles would conclude in gunfire and mass graves. He sat in that church until dawn, preparing himself for the conclusion. And then something occurred that he still couldn't explain years later, something that defied logic and strategy, something that looked for all the world like divine intervention. Saul Cantoni endured 3 days of Gestapo interrogation, 3 days in a basement cell in Perugia, 20 miles from Assisi, where interrogators operated in shifts to break him. They beat him with rubber truncheons. They burned him with cigarettes. They screamed inquiries in his countenance for hours without pause, demanding the identities of everyone involved in the forgery operation. And Cantoni, a 8-year-old merchant who had never been trained for this, who possessed no experience with resistance work, who was merely an individual attempting to endure, executed something extraordinary. He provided them nothing, not a single identity, not a single location. He insisted, through fractured teeth and swollen eyes, that he had purchased his fraudulent documents from a stranger in Florence whose countenance he couldn't recall. He claimed he had come to Assisi alone, knew nobody, and was simply attempting to conceal until the war concluded. The narrative was riddled with holes. The interrogators knew he was lying. Yet, without corroborating evidence, without other detentions to pressure him with, they couldn't penetrate through his wall of fabricated ignorance. On the fourth day, Cantoni was transferred to a holding establishment to await deportation to a concentration camp in Germany. The Gestapo filed him as a captured Jew with fraudulent papers, a routine case in their endless bureaucracy of death. They never connected him to Assisi's operation. They never followed the thread back to Father Niccacci. The individual they had arrested was, in their assessment, merely another desperate refugee, and they had quotas to fill and trains to load. Cantoni was processed, tagged, and scheduled for transport. Yet here's where the narrative takes a turn that still defies explanation. The truck transporting Cantoni and 17 other prisoners to the railway station in Florence never reached its destination. According to German documentation, it was ambushed by partisans on a mountain passage. The guards eliminated, the prisoners liberated. According to partisan documentation, no such ambush occurred. The truck simply vanished. Some witnesses later claimed they observed it abandoned on the side of the road, its engine still operating, with no bodies and no blood. Cantoni himself reappeared in Assisi 6 weeks later, half-starved and unable to explain how he had escaped or who had assisted him. He recalled fragments. Walking through forests, concealing in barns, being nourished by farmers who posed no inquiries. Yet the particulars were fog, and Father Niccacci, who had spent those 6 weeks certain that Cantoni's detention would be their downfall, determined not to pose too many inquiries. Some miracles, he reasoned, weren't meant to be comprehended. They were meant to be accepted. Yet Cantoni's detention, however mysteriously it resolved, had transmitted a message that Niccacci couldn't disregard. The operation was no longer invisible. The Gestapo was actively pursuing fraudulent identities, and their methods were improving. The interrogation techniques were more sophisticated, the document examinations more thorough, and most hazardous of all, they were beginning to employ informants. Italian collaborators who infiltrated communities and reported suspicious behavior for cash payments or food allocations. Trust, which had been the foundation of the complete operation, was now a liability. Niccacci implemented fresh protocols. Refugees were prohibited from speaking to anyone outside their immediate concealment location. Contact between different monasteries and convents was minimized. Even the Breezy household reduced their forgery work, generating fresh documents only when absolutely necessary. The operation contracted, became more paranoid, more isolated. It was the sole way to endure. August delivered unbearable heat and the sound of distant artillery. Allied troops were pushing northward from Rome, engaging German defensive positions in brutal mountain warfare. Assisi discovered itself in a strange liminal territory, too far northward for immediate liberation, yet too proximate to the front positions for German troops to disregard. Troops commenced fortifying positions around the community, excavating trenches, establishing machine gun nests, preparing for the possibility that Assisi might become a battlefield. This terrified Niccacci for a reason that had nothing to do with his own safety. If combat reached Assisi, if the community became a combat zone, the fragile protection of its holy status would evaporate. Allied artillery didn't distinguish between basilicas and bunkers. German troops didn't respect sanctuary when bullets were flying. 300 refugees concealing in monasteries and convents would be trapped in a war zone with nowhere to flee. Niccacci reached a determination that violated every instinct of caution he had developed over 18 months. He contacted through underground channels to the Allied command, informing them that Assisi was providing shelter for hundreds of Jewish refugees and pleading with them to avoid shelling the community. It was an insane gamble. The message needed to pass through multiple partisan operations, any one of which could be compromised by German infiltrators. If the Gestapo intercepted it, they would know precisely what Assisi was concealing and could liquidate the complete operation before Allied troops arrived. Yet Niccacci had exhausted safe options. He was gambling that the Allies would receive his message, that they would care sufficiently about 300 Jewish existences to adjust their military tactics, and that the Germans wouldn't discover his communication before liberation arrived. It was a desperate move by a desperate individual who had been playing a flawless game of chess for over a year and was now in the endgame, compelled to sacrifice pieces and pray. September 1944. The sound of artillery intensified each day, echoing through Assisi's stone passages like distant thunder that never ceased. German troops were entrenching, transforming the hills around the community into defensive positions. Allied reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead daily, photographing military installations and charting targets. Father Niccacci spent those days in a state of paralyzed terror, observing troops move equipment through streets where Jewish youngsters played, camouflaged as Catholic orphans, knowing that at any moment the order could arrive to evacuate, to search every structure, to verify every identity. And if that occurred, if German officers determined to relocate their command post into one of the monasteries, if they requisitioned the convents for troop housing, the complete facade would collapse in minutes. 18 months of flawless execution undone by the chaos of warfare. On September 15th, a German major designated Heinrich Schultz arrived in Assisi with orders to establish a field headquarters in the Basilica of St. Francis itself. Not in a side structure, not in administrative quarters. In the Basilica, the holiest destination in the complete community, where invaluable medieval frescoes covered every wall and the bones of St. Francis rested in a crypt below the altar. Schultz was an officer who respected culture and history, yet he was also a soldier following orders in a losing warfare. He informed Bishop Nicolini that the German army would be occupying portions of the basilica within 48 hours, and that all clergy should prepare to relocate to smaller establishments. For Nicolini and Niccacci, this was the catastrophe they had been fearing. The basilica wasn't merely a church, it was the nerve center of their complete operation. The place where Niccacci coordinated movements, where counterfeit documents were stored in concealed compartments, where encrypted messages from the Vatican arrived through trusted messengers. Losing the basilica signified losing control. Bishop Nicolini executed something that demanded either extraordinary bravery or complete madness. He refused. He communicated to Major Schultz directly that the Basilica of St. Francis was safeguarded under international law as a cultural heritage destination, that its desecration would be a war crime, and that he, as Bishop of Assisi, would personally report the occupation to the Vatican, to the International Red Cross, and to neutral diplomatic channels. Schultz was taken aback. No Italian administrator had spoken to him like that in months. Most collaborated eagerly or capitulated immediately. Yet here was an elderly bishop, physically frail, yet radiating an authority that didn't originate from guns or rank, communicating to a German major that some boundaries could not be crossed. Schultz could have arrested Nicolini on the spot. He could have ordered troops to drag the bishop out of his own church, yet something in Nicolini's eyes, some combination of faith and absolute certainty, gave Schultz pause. He stated he would consult with his superiors and departed without issuing further orders. For 3 days, nothing occurred. Niccacci and Nicolini waited, anticipating troops to return at any moment with detention warrants or worse. The refugees were instructed to prepare for emergency evacuation, though nobody could explain where they would evacuate to, with German roadblocks on every passage. And then, on September 18th, word arrived through partisan channels that Major Schultz had been reassigned to another sector. The Basilica occupation order had been quietly rescinded. No explanation was provided. No official communication was transmitted. The Germans simply abandoned the plan and established their headquarters in a requisitioned hotel on the edge of town instead. Nicolini believed it was divine intervention. Niccacci suspected Schultz had associations in the German military who still valued Italy's cultural heritage and had pulled strings behind the scenes. Yet the reason didn't matter. What mattered was that the basilica remained in their control, and the operation endured another near-death experience. However, endurance was becoming a daily negotiation with fate. By late September, German troops were stretched thin, demoralized, and increasingly savage in their treatment of civilians. Summary executions for suspected partisan activity became common. Complete villages were burned in retaliation for ambushes on German convoys. And in this atmosphere of collapsing order, the rules that had safeguarded Assisi began to erode. Captain Schmidt, the zealot commandant, announced that he would be executing a final, comprehensive census of all religious institutions in Assisi before German troops potentially withdrew northward. Every monk, every nun, every refugee youngster would be photographed, fingerprinted, and documented. The records would be cross-examined against church archives dating back years, and anyone whose narrative didn't withstand scrutiny would be detained for further investigation. This wasn't another routine examination. This was a dragnet, crafted to catch precisely the kind of operation Niccacci had been operating, and there was no way to avoid it. Schmidt had established a date, October 1st, 1944. 2 weeks away. 2 weeks to prepare for an examination that would either validate 18 months of deception or expose it as the elaborate fraud it had always been. Father Niccacci gathered every member of the operation for an urgent council in the crypt beneath the basilica. The Brizzi household, Mother Superior Ermella, local resistance contacts, and representatives from each monastery and convent crowded into the underground chamber where Francis had been laid to rest 7 centuries previously. The air was thick with desperation. Schmidt's census was scheduled for October 1st, and this time there would be no diplomatic maneuvering, no appeals to cultural heritage, no last-minute reassignments. Every individual in Assisi would be accounted for, and the forgery operation that had sustained 300 existences simply couldn't endure that level of scrutiny. Fingerprints would reveal identities that fraudulent designations couldn't conceal. Photographs would be transmitted to German intelligence databases in Berlin. Cross-examining with pre-war church archives would expose the invented backstories that refugees had been existing for 18 months. The mathematics were brutal and straightforward. They possessed 2 weeks to make 300 people disappear or observe them all perish. The options were impossibly limited. Transporting 300 refugees out of Assisi through German-controlled territory was logistically unfeasible and tactically suicidal. The passages were monitored, the roadblocks heavily armed, and any mass movement would provoke immediate investigation. Concealing them in the countryside signified abandoning the infrastructure of monasteries and convents, leaving vulnerable people exposed to starvation and weather with winter approaching. Remaining in place signified certain discovery. Luigi Brizzi proposed the most radical resolution: forge an entirely fresh set of documents claiming that a typhoid outbreak had struck Assisi's religious communities, compelling the immediate quarantine and evacuation of all clergy to isolated establishments outside town. The Germans feared disease more than they feared partisans. A typhoid scare might purchase them time, yet it would also demand complicity from local physicians willing to falsify medical documentation, and one skeptical German physician could unravel the complete scheme within hours. Then, on September 23rd, something occurred that changed everything. A partisan messenger arrived in Assisi, transporting a message that had originated from Allied command in liberated Rome. The message was straightforward, typed on thin paper and unsigned for security reasons. It stated, "Assisi recognized as cultural sanctuary. No offensive operations planned within city limits. Civilian protection protocols in effect." Father Niccacci's desperate communication, transmitted weeks previously, had reached its destination. Allied commanders, coordinating with Jewish advocacy groups and Vatican administrators, had designated Assisi as a protected zone. They would not shell it. They would not bomb it. And they were advancing faster than German intelligence anticipated. The front positions that had seemed distant in August were now less than 30 miles away. Liberation, which had felt like a distant dream, was suddenly a matter of weeks, perhaps even days. Yet this generated a fresh dilemma. Could the operation maintain together for a few more weeks against Schmidt's census? Or would they fracture at the final moment after enduring 18 months of miracles and close calls? Niccacci reached a determination that was part strategy and part supplication. He would not evacuate the refugees. He would not generate fake typhoid outbreaks. He would instead delay Schmidt's census through bureaucratic obstruction, clerical incompetence, and administrative excuses until Allied troops arrived. It was a gamble that hinged on timing, fortune, and the hope that the German war apparatus, now collapsing across Europe, would be too disorganized to enforce its own deadlines. He commenced submitting documentation to Schmidt's office, claiming that church records were incomplete, that monks were ill and couldn't be photographed, that the census would demand more time to be executed properly. Every delay purchased another day. Every administrative complication generated another modest obstacle, and Schmidt, overwhelmed with logistics as German troops prepared for potential retreat, granted extensions he would never have permitted months previously. October 1st arrived and passed without the census occurring. Schmidt rescheduled it for October 8th, then October 15th. Each delay was a minor triumph, each postponement a temporary reprieve. And on the morning of October 16th, 1944, the sound that Father Niccacci had been waiting to hear for 18 months finally echoed through Assisi's medieval passages. Not the thunder of German artillery, not the roar of Luftwaffe bombers, but the rumble of Allied armored vehicles. American and British troops advancing through the Italian countryside, faster than anyone had predicted, reached the outskirts of Assisi without discharging a shot. German troops, already in full retreat, abandoned their positions during the night. Captain Schmidt and his troops were gone. The occupation was over. And 300 Jewish refugees who had existed as Catholic clergy for 18 months emerged from their concealment locations into the morning light of a liberated community. Not a solitary one had been deported. Not a solitary one had been eliminated. They had all endured. The liberation of Assisi should have been a moment of celebration, of public recognition for an operation that defied every statistical probability of success. 300 existences preserved through 18 months of flawless deception under Nazi occupation. It was a miracle of organization, bravery, and collective silence that deserved to be proclaimed from every headline. Yet that's not what occurred. In the chaos of post-war Italy, with millions displaced and complete cities in ruins, the narrative of Assisi became merely one more footnote in a continental tragedy. The refugees departed Assisi quietly, returning to homes that no longer existed or searching for family members who had vanished into the camps. Father Niccacci returned to instructing mathematics at the seminary. Luigi and Trento Brizzi went back to operating their print establishment. Bishop Nicolini resumed his ecclesiastical obligations, and the operation that had functioned with the precision of a spy agency simply dissolved back into ordinary existence. No medals were bestowed, no ceremonies conducted. The silence that had safeguarded them during the warfare continued to safeguard them after it, not from Nazis anymore, but from the uncomfortable inquiries that heroism perpetually raises about those who executed nothing. For nearly 30 years, the narrative remained buried. Survivors scattered across the globe rarely spoke of their time in Assisi, not because they weren't grateful, but because survivors' guilt is a burden that silences even gratitude. The clergy who had risked everything remained humble, insisting they had simply executed what their beliefs demanded, nothing more. It wasn't until 1973, almost 3 decades following the war's conclusion, that an investigative journalist designated Alexander Ramati commenced piecing together the narrative through interviews with survivors and forgotten church documentation. His publication, The Assisi Underground, finally delivered international attention to what Father Niccacci and his operation had accomplished. By then, many of the key figures were elderly or deceased. Niccacci himself existed until 1977, long enough to observe his narrative told, yet he never sought recognition. When asked why he had risked everything, he provided the identical answer he had provided Bishop Nicolini in September of 1943, because his vows demanded it. Today, if you visit Assisi, there's a modest plaque on the wall of the Basilica of St. Francis. It commemorates the rescue operation in straightforward language, listing no designations, claiming no credit, simply stating that between 1943 and 1944, this community preserved 300 Jewish existences. Tourists proceed past it every day, most without halting, unaware of the magnitude of what occurred in these cobblestone passages. The basilica still stands, its frescoes intact, its crypt still housing the bones of a saint who preached peace 8 centuries previously. And somewhere in that structure's shadows, you can almost perceive the echo of frightened supplications whispered in Hebrew by people pretending to be Catholic, safeguarded by clergy who comprehended that faith without action is merely philosophy. The narrative of Assisi matters because it proves something we desperately need to recall in an age of resurgent hatred and casual cruelty. That ordinary people, when confronted with evil, can choose bravery over compliance. That a mathematics instructor can become a master of deception when existences depend on it. That faith communities can provide shelter for those whom governments condemn. That 300 existences in the grand accounting of the Second World War might seem statistically insignificant, yet to those 300 people and their descendants, it signified everything. The operation didn't preserve millions. They preserved who they could with what they possessed against impossible odds. And they executed it, not because they were heroes by character, but because they made heroism a daily choice. That's the lesson that history attempted to bury, and that's the truth we need to resurrect. That resistance doesn't demand superpowers or special training. It merely demands the willingness to say no when everyone else is saying yes. And to safeguard existence when the world has determined that some existences don't matter. Assisi's Underground Railroad wasn't a miracle, it was a blueprint. And the world keeps forgetting to read it.